Okay, whoever you are that just hit the play button, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown, and whether this is your first time here or you're a returning friend, I'm deeply grateful to you. Your attention is quite valuable, and that you have chosen to place it here is no small thing. I really appreciate it. I hope this moment is finding you reasonably well. Given the asynchronous nature of this medium in which we have been brought together, I have no idea where you are in time and space right now. But at the moment in which I am recording this, I am sitting in an attic in Easton, Pennsylvania on a dark and rainy Sunday evening. Oh, just shy of 2 weeks away from zeroing in on the end of the year 2023. You know, for someone like myself, who's a Gen Xer, ever since 2001, every time I say the year, it feels like I'm in a science fiction movie. And boy, has that really accelerated over the last few years. I don't know how everybody else out there is doing. I sure hope that you're doing okay. I don't know if everybody feels the same kinds of strains and just sense of weirdness about. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm projecting on you. But I've been talking about this over the last few weeks, how it has felt very challenging, and it continues to feel that way. It's really not an easy time. It's hard to feel grounded or steady. I mean, I, generally speaking, oscillate between sliding back into a feeling of okayness that I've been cultivating over many years, and a certain trust and faith in the way life is unfolding that allows me to not feel full of anxiety all the time or overcome by fear. But you can just start to feel how when the inputs from the outside, or when like the spreadsheets and like just the way things are when you go to the supermarket, you know, there's a certain point at which it starts to feel harder. It starts to feel harder to maintain that. And I find myself slipping out of it into fear and into not feeling okay or grounded. Fortunately, I do catch it when I slip out of it, and it's not that often. And I have a set of tools and things that I utilize and structures and rituals in my life to help me when stuff starts to feel like it's out of whack. But when stuff's feeling like it's out of whack all the time, and it's not like my internal bullshit or my demons, it's the larger world, or there's some outside forces at work that don't have my interests at heart, that are working against my self-interest and the interests of like humanity and the planet. And you know, a lot of people I talk to sense that or feel like things are awry in some way, but it's not very clear like what, if anything, an individual could do, or even sometimes the idea of getting together and working collectively is not that plausible, at least. I don't know. But what I will say is by far the most helpful thing for me is at least trying to connect with other people and sort of get where they're coming from and bounce off like my experience with other people. That's what this show is a lot about. And I'm very happy that today's talk with my friend Katie Hemphill is an occasion in which I did that. Katie is someone I met back in 2022. She signed up for my year-long teacher training program. And in the course of that time, that year that we spent in meetings and in practice together, I would get these little glimpses of who she was and what she was about. And they were very intriguing to me on a couple different levels because she comes from a background that's seemed very different from mine. Like her early pursuits were in biomedical engineering. And then here she was in my training, like kind of coming together with me on yoga and like all this animism stuff I was into at the time. And so I always had it in mind at some point that maybe we would have a chat for the show. And oh, the stars aligned and it happened. And it was really wonderful to reconnect with her, having been not in contact with her that much over a year since she finished the training with me, and kind of check in with her and what's been going on. And it really connected with a lot of other things I've been thinking about in terms of how I am and how we are in the larger world. So very cool to talk with Katie, and it's a pleasure to be bringing it to you today. Real quick before we get to it, let me mention that if you do want to connect with me in other ways outside of this show, then please let's do that. There's lots of opportunities for it. As I was just mentioning, Katie was someone who did my year-long teacher training program, and that is available to you. That is on rolling admission right now. So if you did want to make 2024 a year that you dedicate to some deep yoga inquiry, and you think that I might be a person that you'd want to do that with, then you should consider registering for the teacher training program. If that's too much to bite off, I'm not one for like making a New Year's resolution that feels like a huge thing. So if you want something that's not so much of a commitment, there's all kinds of individual components from that training, whether it's practices or whether it's the weekly discussion group or other videos, and even the podcast premium where you can get into the full length archives of the show. There should be something, hopefully, that would suit you. You can find all of this stuff at jbrownyoga.com. One quick technical note that at the very end of my conversation with Katie, right when we were about to say goodbye, the internet cut out. So we had to scramble a little bit. I managed to call her up on the phone and record a little something. We managed to piece it together, but I just wanted to let you know that that happens. You'll hear. Okay, I think that's going to be it for now. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Katie Hemphill. Hello, Katie.
Hi, Jay.
Hi.
Oh my gosh, it's so good to hear your voice.
It's really cool to be checking in with you too. And I know you listen to the show, so let me just say I'm recording and let's just consider it having just begun.
Yes, perfect.
Oh, so cool. Yes, I was just sitting here thinking about the fact that it was almost a year ago that we finished doing the teacher training together.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I wonder how Katie's been doing over the last year. I know a little bit because I read your posts and stuff. But it's great to have this moment to reconnect with you and touch base on a couple things. I have been thinking about you in some regards, and I love that you reached out to me after that intro from the forest.
Yeah, it was one of those, like, at some point I've got to reach out to Jay because I know we've got to do this. And then, I'd listen to one episode and I'd kind of get pinged like now could be a good moment. And then, I'd talk myself out of it. And then I sat down and was listening to that forest intro and I was like, okay, this is it. I can't argue anymore.
Yeah. Well, you're still in New Mexico?
I am. Yes.
All right, cool. I knew that you were there and just wanted to make sure nothing happened in the last year that I didn't know about, but you're still there. And I guess I was thinking about, like a place to start. And I was thinking about my impressions of you when I first met you at the beginning of 2022, when you signed up for the training. And you sent like your initial little bit on like your own yoga origin story to me. And that was when I first sort of learned, or actually I had learned in an intro meeting with you that you had this like biomedical engineering background. And it really struck me because I don't know why, but when I imagined what like a biomedical engineer looked like, you were not the person that I imagined. And I guess I'm curious how you got into that in the first place. Like, were you always good in math and were you sciencey, or like, how do you end up deciding to go into that as an area of study when you went to college?
Yeah, it's a good question because there's a lot there. A lot of decisions that brought me to a place that I just did not fit in. But yeah, I mean, in school, I was very much so like a nerdy STEM kid, like math, science, like loved taking as much math, science as I could. I think what really did it was the end of high school. I took this AP psychology class. And it was like, I just immediately fell in love with the brain, like the mind. So it was really this love for neuroscience. I think that really set me off in that direction. Like I think if I had chosen a path that really sang most truly to me at that point, it would have been neuroscience or anything that could have got me closer to like, you know, just being immersed in the world of the human mind. But,
well, interesting to note that wanting to be immersed in the mind meant studying the brain.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But so with that, it was a lot of practical advice that I was given. You know, I have a lot of older siblings and they kind of gone the college route before me. And I was given a bit of practical advice that was like, Katie, if you go get a science degree, that's not very practical. Like if you just go get a science degree, it's not going to actually get you anything unless you go on to get, say, a PhD. And while I did want that at that point in time, it was still this like, you know, if you get a biomedical engineering degree, if you have that engineering part in your title, like you'll be able to get out of college and get a job. Like there was that really practical part of it there.
Were they scientists as well or academics as well? I mean, clearly they had some insight because they're probably right about it's probably easier to make a living as an engineer than a neuroscientist trying to do research or whatever, right?
Yeah, very much so. And I actually had an older brother at the time getting his PhD in biomedical engineering, and he was studying neurotrauma. So it was like I had that path already carved out for me.
I see. So yeah, that was a kind of no-brainer, and it was, and in a way, smart advice.
It honestly, it's one of those where like I spent a lot of time being really frustrated with the fact that I like spent all this money on school and got out and then was like, wait, no, this isn't actually, you know, the path I want to follow. But at the same time, there was so much perfection in it all because it did unfold where I did get to go onto school, and I picked one of the biggest schools in the country because I had opportunity where I could go get my engineering degree, but I could study anything I wanted to study. And I am a bit of a super nerd in an academic sense. So I did, like I went and took all the classes that spoke to me and got my engineering degree. So by the time I graduated, you know, that practical piece was relevant. I was able to get a job and also go pursue a path that really spoke more to my heart and my mind's curiosity.
Right. Like you always seemed, as far as I can tell, to have kind of like the wellness on the side. I guess that started in college. I remember you wrote that in your thing, that even in the midst when you were first getting your degrees, yoga had become kind of a thing. Like me, like you took it in college. Did I remember that right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as soon as I got to college, it really hit me like, okay, I'm on my own now. I get to make all my own decisions about how I spent my time and what food I eat. So I immediately got very much so into nutrition. Very much so like open the doors to, okay, what's kind of which there's a lot to unpack around this. So I don't want to like open a can of worms with it, but, kind of the like, how is the best way to be eating? Like, what are sort of
like
the healthiest
optimizing
foods?
your protein count per meal and all that stuff.
All that stuff that I was immersed in for so long and now kind of like makes me cringe a lot.
We can come back to that. Actually, very interesting. That idea about optimization and kind of coming up with formulas of numbers for your health.
Yeah.
That. Yeah. But you went to a yoga class there?
Yeah. And the yoga class was really, again, it's another one of those things that kind of makes me cringe. But also there's a part of it that's like, there was something more here, which I think is a common theme that you like to talk about. What's like, what's your doorway into yoga? Like, what's the thing that pulls you into it? But then, the allness of yoga is there to meet you. So signing up for that yoga class, I honestly don't really know why I did. I just know like it was the second semester of college and I had packed my schedule to the extreme, with all these techie classes. And, for whatever reason, I was looking at my schedule and I was able to fill it with 2 more credits. And for whatever reason, like a yoga class spoke to me like, hey, come here at the end of a day where from 9 to 4:30, I've been, going through physics and differential equations. And I just remember the end of the day, like I'd get out of my differential equations class and I was just fried. And then I'd be like, okay, I have to walk all the way to the other end of campus, get myself to this yoga class. But I was smart. I tricked myself into it because in this yoga class, your grade was dependent on attendance. And like, God forbid, I didn't get an A in a class, so I had to show up to every single class. So I'd get out of class, walk myself across campus, sit down, go through, and I keep trying to remember what sort of class it really was. I think it was an Ashtanga kind of class.
You mentioned it was like a more rigorous vinyasa class, if I recall.
Yeah, it was definitely rigorous. It was definitely like physically challenging. And I remember getting out of it and walking back across campus to the dorms and just feeling amazing. And just like, wow, like I'm a new person.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I do also remember you saying something about someone reading sutras to you or something like that. Do I remember that right?
There was, and that's another part of the story that kind of breaks my heart at this point, is that at the end of class, there was 15 minutes where he would read the Yoga Sutras. And I remember me like being my science and engineering self at that point in time, just being like, what is this? Having no interest in it, like feeling amazing after the class and just like wanting to get back to whatever I was doing before. So at that point in time, yes, he was reading the sutras. And if I could go back in time, I'd like shake myself a little bit and be like, hey, listen, like soak this in. And I'm sure I did at some level because in the years that followed, it's much more so the philosophy of yoga instead of the practice that really pulled me in.
But the seeds were planted though. That's what I'm saying.
Exactly. The seeds were planted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I had a similar story as a lot of people listening probably have, where you were in college and these yoga classes were just there as like whatever movement classes or something. And they planted those seeds and later on, they sprout.
Yes.
And I guess I'm curious. So did you start doing marathon running before or after you graduated college?
I signed up for my first half marathon at the end of college. So I had moved straight from my bachelor's into my master's, and it was kind of like this time where, you know, a lot of my friends had graduated and moved on, and it was, you know, like definitely this shift in my life, but I was still very much so like, I was trying to cram a master's degree into a very short amount of time. So it was still very stressful, packed, but you know, like I've always been an athlete, and in school I ran pretty regularly, but running became a thing for me that was not about competition in school. Just, you know, like I could go out for a run and get out of my head, and it was just nice. And then at the end of school, for whatever reason, it was finally like, you know, I actually want to like sign up for a race and see what happens. So I did. It was the end of the year, and it was a really good outlet for me to, you know, go run fast, push my body in that way, and really like burn off some energy that needed to be burned off. And ran that first half marathon, and basically just like completely exceeded my expectations. Like I said, in school, I was running a lot, but it was always slow, just kind of like, you know, not really checking out my pace or anything. And then that first half marathon, I think I set my expectation at like, okay, I can run at like a 9:30 pace or something. And then ended up running the whole thing at like a 7:45 pace, which just like, it was insane.
Yeah.
Like it was one of those moments in life.
Most people are like, I hope I finish it. You're like,
yeah. Yeah. Just one of those moments in life that just completely caught me off guard. And like, I blew myself away. Like I didn't know I had this in me.
Interesting. Wow. That's pretty cool. So now I totally get it. Why you continue doing it after that. When you switched from bachelor's to master's, did you get a job at that time, or did you get a job later?
I didn't get, well, so it depends what you mean by job, but like a job as a biomedical engineer.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, I didn't actually get until, it actually took me a year and a half after I finished my master's degree to get a job. I had done this thing where I thought I was going to go on to get a PhD. So I set up my whole resume very beautifully to like go continue on the academia path. Like I had, you know, gotten really good grades and, done a lot of research in academic laboratories, all the things that are important when you're applying to a PhD program. Meanwhile, everything you need to go get a corporate job is entirely different. So, turns out they don't care so much about grades and the fact that you spent all this time doing all this cool research. Like they want a very different skill set. So it actually took me about a year and a half to find a job, which was okay with me because I wasn't like enthusiastic about that part. And it gave me a year and a half to, really just pursue my own projects, my own curiosities.
I'm sorry. What was the thing that you needed to do different or learn in order to get the corporate gig?
Isn't that the question?
I mean, because it's interesting because you pursue
job?
something just for the pursuit of learning. Like you said originally, you just were like, I want to learn about the mind. And so it would be a natural and obvious thing to be like, and you're already nerdy and into like science, I'll study neuroscience or the brain. And then you get that good advice from your, your brother and sisters. And they're like, yeah, but you need to get a job. And so in school, you go the academic route because you're good at that too. But what you were doing to excel in an academic path wasn't what you needed to get a corporate job. So I'm curious what it is different that you needed to do to get the gig.
I mean, as far as I understand, it's really just so much about like connections. And the advice I'd been given in school was, if you want a job after school, get an internship, at a company. And I didn't do that. The thing that eventually got me a job was, I think, going to a job fair and talking directly to someone from HR. And that eventually led to an interview So, I mean, it's business, which is connections as far as I understand. It's still a bit of a
like
mystery
any
to me,
field really, but it is a particular skill that, like is there that many people in the job pool for that kind of job? Is there that many biomedical engineers?
It's definitely a growing field. And it's one where like the biomedical engineering degree means a certain something, but at the end of the day, it's like people are pulling from, if you're an engineer, that's what matters. So a lot of the people I worked with were mechanical or electrical or different sorts of engineers. So yeah, there's a big job pool, but it's one of those questions where I'm like, are we talking about pre-pandemic, post-pandemic? Like the job world's kind of crazy right now, but yeah, there's definitely competition.
And so you made one reference in like a meeting. There might have been two, but there was like one reference that I have in my brain where we were like in a teacher training meeting together, and you talked about looking at a petri dish at cells and trying to get them to do a certain thing or whatever. And I was like, whoa, I guess I've just few of us have had an experience of that. So I guess I'm asking, what was the job of a biomedical engineer at that corporate gig? Like, what were you doing? What was the kind of work that you were doing?
Yeah, so that's two different things. My corporate job, I didn't get to do anything like that.
Okay.
That was in school. That was in research labs. That's when I was studying neurotrauma. So we were studying, basically signaling pathways in the brain when someone, receives a traumatic brain injury. There's these pathways that get activated that are kind of like a healing repair process. So I had, what I sometimes refer to as little baby neurons, although that wouldn't be the technical term, and I wouldn't say that while in that field. But yeah, basically, so they were neural progenitor cells, which are basically precursors to neurons. So they're cells that, they're stem cells that are getting the, I'm talking about this, I have to like switch over to that part of my brain that I don't use very often anymore. But yeah, they're cells that, so when you have stem cells, they have the potential to turn into different cell lines. Mm-hmm. So, something happens in your body that releases a certain, biochemical that, communicates to that cell to, turn into a certain cell type. And so, these cell types were on a path to turn into neurons. And yeah,
and you're so you're like looking at stem cells under the microscope and analyzing them, or what, these like cross sections of people's brains? Like, what's the actuality of it?
So I never worked with brain tissue. There were people in the labs in a couple different labs that I was in that were working with brain tissue, from mice, but I never did that. These actually came from, they're just individual cells that came from so they were human induced stem cells. So you can basically just like take a sample from, I'm not sure exactly, but some sort of tissue from just like a grown human. And then you can, basically trick it to go back. So, generally cells go forward. They go from a more general stem cell line to a more specific stem cell line, but you can program them to go backwards. So say you have like a skin cell, you can program them to go backwards to a more general stem cell.
Okay, and then wait, sorry, I gotta stop you. How do you program a cell?
It's all about, and so this gets to exactly what I was doing was they're in a dish. They're in a solution.
Okay. So you have a little petri dish with some solution in there. And if you look under a microscope, there's like little squiggly things. That's what we're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Little squiggly things. Exactly.
Yeah.
And you're basically like injecting different biochemicals that, would be existent in the body. But you have those in isolation and you're injecting them into the medium, the solution that the cells are in. Mm-hmm. And then that biochemical enters into the cell and it tells the cell to do something.
And you see how it responds to whatever you introduce into the solution.
Yes.
Got you. And the idea was, in terms of the trauma work that you referenced, it was to see how those cells responded to certain biochemical things that are associated with trauma in the body?
Yeah. So I was looking, I was on different projects, but the main project I was on, my thesis, was a particular signaling molecule, SDF1 alpha, and it basically it's not just in the brain. It is released in response to injury. So if you have injury in the body, it's basically released and it forms a gradient that stem cells then follow, and that tells the cells where to go. Like, oh, there's an injury over here, but the cells are released at a different location. This gradient basically tells the cells where to travel to get to the site of injury. So I was doing experiments where I was, basically seeing how these cells responded to that specific protein.
Wow. I mean, I remember you also saying something about like the reductionist lens that you were working through at that time when you were doing that stuff, and I've said this before, like it is about kind of breaking things apart into like their smallest pieces, like you're saying, isolating the cell and then whatever else is going into the medium. But you had said something about the idea that you at some point you put it back together to make meaning.
Yes. Yeah.
I guess that's the sticky part. Like, do engineers put it back together to make meaning, or do engineers just pull it apart? Or are they supposed to do both of those things?
It's a both and, I would say,
because I guess engineering, I don't think of engineering as being about meaning. Like, I think of it as mechanistic, I guess.
So we're in the realm of science and engineering. I would say a lot of the reductionist part is more like the scientific process. But then in the scientific process, you're still, trying to build it back up again to make meaning. And then, what is engineering? I would say engineering is problem solving. So the engineering part is we are looking at a problem, traumatic brain injury, and we want a solution to work to heal that problem. And this is where it is really sticky, because what I saw there was really cool science. Like, we were learning things about the brain, but from like a problem solution perspective, we were nowhere near any sort of solution. If anything, all I saw was us injuring mouse brains like that.
Yeah, there's like a kind of a miracle of discovery, it seems to me, like when you are able to kind of break what's happening down in cell lines to that degree and watch the way cells form or can be, transformed into a weird regression. I mean, I find that wild that you can take a cell and program it to go backwards through its progression. That's crazy idea.
Yeah.
But that all sounds very like, I could see how that would be exciting and kind of meaningful. But you said that was when you were in school doing stuff, but that wasn't the corporate gig. What did you do with the corporate gig?
Paperwork.
Paperwork, really? Like just write stuff up and stuff?
I mean, so I had I don't know what we could call 3 different jobs while I was there. And so I was working in quality. So I'm working on the side of medical devices where, problems occur. So this is something you learn in design, the engineering field, is that any time you create something, right? So you have a problem and you have a solution. Anytime you bring that solution into the world, we were creating medical devices. There's never a perfect solution, right? That thing is always going to create more problems. And what we could call a high quality device isn't a perfect one. You're never going to have a perfect device that completely addresses the problem and doesn't create any other problems. Instead, what happens in reality is you have a device, and again, if it's high quality, it does address the problem to a high degree, and its adverse effects are minimized. So in one sense, you could say that's what my job was doing, was risk analysis, where you're quantifying, okay, based off of the benefit and based off of, the potential failures that we're seeing, how can we minimize those adverse effects and maximize the beneficial effects?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I didn't know that was exactly what you're doing, but the idea of risk analysis and coming up with a number, and then at some point, like a kind of a subjective judgment does have to be made. I'm thinking of, like, I have this one friend, and she is a biomedical writer. So she works for a pharmaceutical company. And last year, I remember we were on the playground while our kids were playing, and she was really stressed out. And I was talking with her, and she kind of like shared with me what some of her stress was about. And it's basically what she was doing. Her job was, like, there was some scientist doing research for this pharmaceutical company, and she's the one who writes out like the language for the research paper. And then there's like the higher ups, and then there's the scientists, and she's kind of like in between them. And they, like, going into it, they established all this different language, and they also established like a mark. Like, she didn't give me the specifics, but like, if this one quantifiable thing that they're measuring is over this number, that means it's a success. And if it's under that number, it hasn't succeeded. Like they choose where the line is to mark it as a success. And basically what happened is they ran the research, and like, it was over the mark, so it was technically a success, but it was like just barely over it, So the scientist wanted to change the language a little bit, because I think the scientist felt uncomfortable because it was so close to the mark. But the higher ups didn't want to do. The higher ups said, no, this is a success. So like, if it's a 5, it's a success. And if it's a 4, it's not a success. And it gets a 5, It just seems like such a kind of gray area when it comes to like medicines and medical devices. And I don't think most of us think of it in that way. We think of it as kind of like, oh, this is the solution.
Yeah, I mean, so much of that hits the target of what I was doing. And I mean, there's an interesting point here that's like, in one way, what made the job boring was when things are clear and when things hit that mark, because most things can't be gray, like from a business and, being within the container that's like FDA guidelines or whatnot, right? Like, most things have to be clear. And then when you do find that gray area, it's this this interesting space where for me, as someone who's working in that field, that's the only interesting space to me, because that's the only time that my brain could actually come online. Like everything else a robot could do, like everything else is just running calculations. But when you're in that gray area and judgment comes in, that's where I think life actually gets interesting. But it is, that's me as the scientist and engineer over here. It's a different story from the patient on the other side. And again, it's, yes, we would like things to be clear. Is this procedure going to solve my problem? Is this procedure going to cause any harm? And, I think as anyone who's been in the medical, has had a medical event, reality is most often a gray area.
Mm. Yeah. And it does make me think of something. I actually wrote down something that you wrote to me while you were in the training, and we were kind of talking about this. And it makes me think, because I'm just doing this other reading, and it has to do with whether or not science can explain things or give us clarity. And I guess it can with some things, but you wrote, I'm going to quote you, and over time you build up the picture from all the little pieces. You find yourself having to create and recreate any idea of a coherent whole until one day you're sitting there with the realization that, well, this method is sort of a bunch of bullshit. So, I mean, I guess we don't want to throw science out, but what were you specifically referring to? Something like, have you come to question the limitations of science?
Well, one thing I will say very clearly, let's not throw out science.
Yeah, I know. I didn't mean to. I painted it in a very provocative light. I know.
Yes, I know. But just making sure that's clear. Science is a beautiful process. It's a process, and it's, we say science and we use, like, this term is thrown around all over the place. It's science-based, like science says, and it's, it's important to be clear on like what science actually is, the scientific process is. In a pure sense, the scientific process is you have an observation, you have a question, and that's a curiosity, right? You have a curiosity. Something lights up your mind and you want to go explore it. And the way you explore it is by setting up experiments. And in those experiments, you're not necessarily trying to find an answer, but what you're trying to do is find answers that aren't true. So the scientific process is really about throwing out what is bullshit. And if you stay true to that, what you get is, again, through this pure process, you're never really getting at like some big picture truth. You're just chipping away at what's not true. But so then we end up with all these little pieces. So getting back to what you said, right? We have all these little pieces that are pointing at truths. And then it's at that point that we then call upon our human minds to try to make sense of it. And we can do that, with, now we have computers and we can build up models and we can pull in equations, and we have these ways to help us take all these little pieces pointing at truth and to build them up into something meaningful. But that process has to rely on the human mind. And whenever you're in that realm, you have to invite in judgment and story and, all those different parts of the self, bias. And yeah. And so this might be a good time to pull in that thingly tabled. That is where I really was when I entered into the yoga teacher training. Was I had spent years in the world of nutrition. So nutrition science is a vastly complex science. And we can say, nutrition science is actually a pretty new science. Like physics is a very old science, right? People have been studying physics for a very long time, right? We have these very rigorous models in the world of physics. But nutrition is very new, and it's also very complex. So you have, what, at its core is someone eats a food, what are its effects on the body? That right there is like enormously complex, right? Any one food has so many different variables. And as soon as that enters into a body, well, the human body has more variables than a human mind can comprehend. And then you add in individual variability, because my body is different than your body, Jay, and any listener is going to have a different body. So, leaving the academic world, and again, me being, okay, what do I want to explore? What's lighting up my mind? Where are my curiosities? I was fully in the world of nutrition, because to me it was this the most complex problem I could imagine at the time. And
everybody's got to eat, right?
And everyone's got to eat. And I mean, it's one of the biggest problems on our world stage, right?
Right, that's true.
The food we eat in the modern world is not generally healthy. And that has very serious effects on every single individual in the modern world. So to me, it was a question that's so important, and also so wildly complex that I was just so lit up and literally spent years, on my own time, doing all I could to understand all the little pieces, right? Understand all these mechanisms and pathways involved in nutrition and metabolic health. And this is where I was when I entered into your world, Jay, was, again, going back to what you quoted from me, is the way we're doing things here is, how shall I say this? Breeds more bullshit than truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it has such important implications because, we're eating all the time, right? And there's how many people are out in the world trying to make.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.